Organisms are classified based on similar characteristics, and the study of that classification is called taxonomy. And the field of taxonomy provides us with categories and groups of living organisms. And taxonomists use a variety of information to categorize our living organisms. They might use DNA or RNA sequences, our genetic material. They might use common ancestry, or they might use common characteristics. There's a variety of other factors a taxonomist might use to help classify living organisms, but those are kind of the big ones. So we aren't going to learn about how taxonomists work. We're just going to look at the fruits of their labor, which is the categories that they have placed living organisms in. And we're going to look at the really big, broad categories. And we're going to start with the domain. So a domain is the largest category, the most broad category that you are going to get. And there are 3 domains: the eukaryotic domain, the archaea domain, and the bacterial domain. Now, the bacteria and archaea domains are our single-celled or unicellular organisms. And they are made up of cell types called prokaryotic cells. And so we call those organisms prokaryotes. Now, prokaryotes are relatively simple organisms. They're always single-celled, and their cell structures are not very complex. They're very simple, but they still perform all of the functions that they need to in order to survive. So this might include gene expression, or taking the information in our DNA and turning it into something useful, instructions for the cell to function. This might be metabolic activities, so all of the chemical reactions within the cells. They're also going to interact with their environment. So they're going to do all the things that a living organism does. Now, the bacteria and the archaea are both prokaryotes, and they differ based on some very specific characteristics, some physiological characteristics, DNA sequence characteristics, but they are both prokaryotic cells. Our other domain are the eukarya domain, or the eukaryotic organisms. Eukaryotes can either be single-celled or multicellular, and most of the eukaryotes that you are familiar with are the multicellular ones, like humans, like cats, like oak trees. Those are all multicellular eukaryotes. Now, eukaryotic cells are different from prokaryotic cells in that they contain compartments within their cells called organelles. And the word organelles means little organ. So if you think about the organs in your body, like your heart, that provides a very specific function to the whole organism. It's a specialized function. And the organelles are the same. We will learn in chapter 4 what those organelles do. We will also learn the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes and the specific common characteristics and the differences. The most important organelle in a eukaryotic organism is the nucleus. The nucleus contains the DNA. Prokaryotes still have DNA. It's just not wrapped up in a little package called the nucleus. Now, the eukaryotes, just like bacteria and archaea, can be separated into smaller groups. We are not going to learn about those smaller groups in bacteria or archaea, but we are going to talk a little bit about the eukaryotic ones. Before we do that, let's talk a little bit about bacteria and archaea. Again, we will come back to bacteria in chapter 4, where we will learn more about prokaryotes. We'll learn a little bit more about the specific cell structure of bacteria. Bacteria are important because they are the most diverse and most abundant type of organism on Earth. Now, this usually surprises students because we think of things we see all the time, like bugs. Like, there are so many bugs on Earth. And plants, there are so many plants, and there are so many animals. but there are far more bacteria. And bacteria get a bad rap because sometimes they cause disease and infections in humans, but there are far more that do literally nothing to you or for you, and many, many more that are important in helping you function correctly, helping the environment function correctly. And so not only are bacteria abundant and diverse, but they also have some really important functions in our ecosystem on Earth. So bacteria are unicellular, which means they are single-celled organisms. They might be clumped together, but each individual cell is its own organism. We'll talk a little more about archaea here because we are not really going to come back to them too much. Archaea, just like bacteria, are prokaryotes. They are also found in a variety of environments, but archaea are unique in that many of them are found in extreme environments in addition to those sort of normal environments. So these environments might be extremely salty lakes, sulfur hot springs, things like that. But most of them don't really have anything to do with eukaryotes. A few semesters ago, I tried to do some research on important archaea, and I did not find any credible source, or at least cited source, that says there are any that cause disease. Doesn't mean they're not, just means in the research I was able to do, I didn't find any. So you might think, well, they're really not important to us. They're just like bacteria, but they're not. They are similar to bacteria in that they are prokaryotes and they share some similar characteristics, but genetically they are more closely related to eukaryotes, which is what makes them important. So a few billion years ago, couple billion, there was a split from a common ancestor between the archaea and the eukaryotes. And this is based on ribosomal RNA sequences. We'll come back to the ribosome again in chapter 4, but the ribosome is important because the ribosome is where our cells build proteins. And ribosomal sequences, or sequences of the RNA molecules that help build ribosomes, can help establish evolutionary relationships. So we are more closely related as eukaryotes to archaea than bacteria. But the other thing that's super important in the evolution of eukaryotic organisms is that it is thought that an archaea swallowed up a bacteria, and instead of digesting it as food, formed a beneficial relationship with it. And from there, evolved into a eukaryote with organelles. So even though we aren't going to come back to archaea and talk too much about them, they're super important for eukaryotic evolutionary history. So last we get to the eukaryotes. As I said a few minutes ago, eukaryotes can be single-celled or multicellular organisms, and a eukaryote is defined by cells with those internal compartments that have various functions. So those archaea swallowed up a bacteria that performed a particular function, and that bacteria evolved into an organelle with a specific function. Organelles that you might have heard of include the nucleus, the chloroplast. That's our structure that performs photosynthesis, and the mitochondria. You all probably lovingly know that as the powerhouse of the cell. Again, chapter 4, super important. We will come back to those organelle functions. So the eukaryotes are further broken down into kingdoms, and those smaller categories are separating our eukaryotes in the way that they take in energy. There are 4 kingdoms: the plants, fungi, animals, and then there's a 4th one that we'll talk about in a few minutes, the protists. And they are not their own kingdom because they are a group that's all different. They are a kingdom because they are a group that's all similar. But the protists are actually part of every one of these other kingdoms. They're just lumped together because they are single-celled or very simple multicellular eukaryotes. So, eukaryotic domain, these are all the things that you know and you love. So, your cat is a eukaryote, and your sister is a eukaryote, and the rose bush in your front yard is a eukaryote. That weird fungus or mold you have growing on your bread is a eukaryote. We've got another phylogenetic tree here that shows a relationship between plants, animals, and fungi. We are going to talk about each one of these just very briefly. We also have in this image here the protists, which again are not part of the three kingdom split because protists are found in each one of these other kingdom categories. So our eukaryotes are defined by how they take in energy. So we will start with plants. Plants are multicellular organisms that carry out photosynthesis. What this means is they get their energy from sunlight. Now they can get nutrients from the soil underneath those plants, but they are not getting energy from the soil. They are absorbing sunlight energy and they are using it to build chemical energy in the form of glucose. So they are taking sunlight energy and converting it into a usable energy source for the entire planet, for all of Earth. They are taking in sunlight energy to power our entire planet. So you are here today because a plant sucked in some sunlight at some point in your past. All of the food that you eat goes back to plants bringing in sunlight energy. Fungi consume their energy in a slightly different manner. Fungi are similar to plants in that they have a cell wall, which is an external cellular structure that provides support, but they do not carry out photosynthesis. Instead, fungi are decomposers and detritivores, which means they get their energy from decaying things that have died, or sometimes things that are living, but they are basically secreting chemicals that are going to dissolve the things that they are living on, and they are going to absorb energy from that decaying matter. So this sounds really gross, and it kind of is, but without fungi, without the decomposers, without the detritivores, we would just be sitting on top of a pile of dead things. So they are super important in maintaining ecosystem health and recycling and transferring energy around an ecosystem. There are also bacteria and archaea that do this as well, that do break down living things. But as far as the eukaryotic domain, our fungi are going to be the ones that are decomposing and breaking down those dead organisms. And then finally, the animals. Animals are always our favorite. They are multicellular organisms that usually have a nervous system. It might be a very primitive nervous system, like in a jellyfish, or a much more complicated one, like in our higher animals, like our lizards and our polar bears and things like that. Animals are unique compared to plants and fungi in that they can move around their environment. And so we have structures that help us do that. But the defining characteristic of an animal is that they get their energy by consuming other organisms. In other words, we eat them. So we either eat the organism directly or we eat an organism that ate an organism. So plants are sort of at the bottom of the food chain. They're bringing in that sunlight energy, but they're not the bottom in the bad sense. They're bottom in the fact that they hold everything else up. So every animal is either eating a plant or eating an animal that eats a plant. And that energy is transferred through those different levels up to the organism that is eating them. Finally, we get to our protists. If you take Biology 102, you will learn much more about protists. We really won't say another thing about them, but they are important because they are part of those other groups. So the protists are characterized because they are single-celled or very simple multicellular organisms, and they are part of all of those other kingdoms. So they're sort of a category within a category that's not really a category. They're very, very diverse because they come from those plant, animal, and fungi kingdoms. But some of the things that you might recognize are algae and kelp. Kelp is basically just really big algae. Those are both protists. Diatoms, if you have seen these, you know what they are. They're little teeny tiny aquatic creatures that are super cool looking. They take on all kinds of shapes and sizes and things like that. Paramecium and amoebas, these are things that live in pond scum, and they're just very simple organisms. Again, mostly single-celled, but sometimes multicellular. So over here, we've got some of the categories of protists. You don't need to know those. Just keep in mind that the protists come from the other three big eukaryotic domains. We can absolutely continue on with further classification of living organisms. We have all of these classification systems that you see in this figure here. This figure is in chapter 1 of your textbook, and it shows all of the subgroups and subgroups and subgroups all the way from domain down to species. So I would like you to know the 3 domains. Their domains can be separated into supergroups. We are not going to talk about those in this class. I do want you to know the eukaryotic kingdoms, those 4 kingdoms that we just talked about. And then when you get to Biology 102, you'll learn about all those things in the middle. And then the only other thing that I want you to be worried about are these last 2, the genus and the species. And the reason that I want you to know about the genus and the species is because the genus and the species is how we provide an organism with its scientific name. And we call this binomial nomenclature. So binomial means 2 names, and then nomenclature basically means how something is named. So we name we name an organism based on its species, which is the smallest level of classification, and then also based on the classification above it. So for example, we've got this lovely little clownfish here. You may know him as Nemo, but scientists know him as Amphiprion ocellaris. The first word is the genus. The second word is the species. And we always write the species name and the genus, their binomial scientific name, in italics with the genus capitalized. Some other examples: Homo sapiens, that's us. We've also got Canis lupus, that's a wolf. The domestic dog is actually Canis lupus familiaris. So that one's just a little tiny bit different. It's like we've got wolves and then we've got another little group beneath it. So all of our living organisms, plants, animals, fungi, whatever they are going to be named based on their scientific name using the genus and the species.